High on the Bolivian altiplano, a British-built steam locomotive is making its final run. It's the early 1940s. For half a century, this engine has hauled silver and tin down from the Andes to the Pacific coast. Part of a railway the British built to move Bolivia's minerals to the world. But the mine it served has closed. The ore ran out, or the price collapsed, or both. There is no cargo waiting at the next station, and there won't be one after that. So the crew does something unusual. They don't return the locomotive to a depot, they don't sell it, they simply stop. Somewhere on the flat, cracked earth outside the town of Uyuni, the fire goes out, the wheels lock, and the engine is left exactly where it stands. It is never moved again. 80 years later, that locomotive is still there. So are more than 100 others, scattered across the salt plain like the vertebrae of some enormous dead animal. Tourists climb on them for photographs. Wind off the salt flat has eaten through the boilers. This is the Great Train Graveyard of Uyuni, and it is only the most photographed example of a pattern that repeats itself across almost every continent. Railways that don't dismantle their dead. They just walk away and leave the locomotive standing. The Uyuni graveyard sits about 3 kilometers outside town, spread across a stretch of the world's largest salt flat. More than 100 steam locomotives and freight cars lie here, most of them built in British factories in the late 1800s and early 1900s, and shipped across the Atlantic and around Cape Horn to reach landlocked Bolivia. Some still show the outline of the Antofagasta and Bolivia Railway Company, the British firm that built and ran this line. None of it is fenced off, none of it is protected. Locals and scrap hunters have stripped anything valuable: brass fittings, copper wiring, gauges, leaving bare steel skeletons behind. And this isn't a museum by design, it became one by neglect. Every attempt to formally preserve the site or turn it into an official heritage park has stalled. What tourists now pay to photograph is, technically, still just abandoned industrial waste that nobody has ever been legally required to clean up. The site itself sits at over 3,600 meters above sea level, 3 kilometers outside town, at the edge of the Salar de Uyuni, a salt desert so vast it covers more than 10,000 square kilometers. That salt is the graveyard's real executioner. Ordinary rust is slow. Salt-laden wind is not. It works its way into every rivet and seam, and 80 years of it has turned solid steam boilers into lace. And Uyuni isn't unique. It's just the most visited version of something that happens to railways everywhere. Locomotives that are simply too expensive to move and not valuable enough to keep, left to rot in place because walking away turned out to be cheaper than closing the job properly. To understand why a locomotive gets abandoned instead of scrapped, you have to understand what a locomotive actually is. 100 to 200 tons of steel, sitting on a set of wheels that only work on rails. A ship stranded at sea can eventually be towed. A car left in a field can be winched onto a flatbed. A steam locomotive on a dead branch line at 3,600 meters of altitude with no working track back to civilization can't go anywhere under its own power, and it's too heavy to drag out any other way. To scrap it properly, you need one of two things: a working railway to haul it to a processing yard, or a cutting crew willing to travel out to the middle of nowhere, torch it apart on site, and truck the pieces out over roads that may not exist. Both cost money, and in a country in economic crisis, with a mining industry that has just collapsed and a railway company that is hemorrhaging cash, that money simply isn't there. So the math becomes brutal but simple. The scrap value of a stranded rural locomotive in 1940s Bolivia was close to nothing. There was no steel-hungry domestic industry to sell it to, no easy way to move it to a smelter, and low global scrap prices to begin with. Meanwhile, the cost of professionally decommissioning it, cutting it up, and hauling the pieces out was real money the railway didn't have. When removal costs more than the metal is worth, the solution isn't scrapping, it's abandonment. You just stop paying attention to the asset and let the desert do the rest. This is the exact opposite of the equation you'd find on a modern American short line. Rail fans and forum threads full of scrap dealers will tell you an old diesel switcher might fetch somewhere in the tens of thousands of dollars once it's cut up, and its copper wiring is stripped out separately because copper without insulation pays a premium. That number only works, though, if the locomotive is already sitting somewhere a scrap truck can reach it. Take away the road, take away the working track, and that same locomotive is worth nothing at all, because you can't extract the value without spending more than the value to get to it. There's a second ingredient, and it's the same one that keeps ship graveyards running in places like Elong. Nobody is legally on the hook. The Antofagasta and Bolivia Railway Company was built by British engineers in the 1880s and 90s to move Bolivian silver and tin to Pacific ports for export. For decades, it worked exactly as designed, until the mining industry that fed it collapsed in the 1930s and 40s, and Bolivia's access to a Pacific coastline had already been lost decades earlier in a war with Chile. Without minerals to haul and without a reliable port connection, the economic reason for the railway disappeared. Ownership fractured, operations wound down, and the company that might once have been responsible for decommissioning its own locomotives effectively stopped existing in any meaningful operational sense. This is the pattern that shows up again and again in train graveyards worldwide. It isn't usually one company making a calculated decision to dump its rolling stock. It's a company or a state railway disappearing through bankruptcy, war, or a mining bust before it can finish the job. Nobody inherits the liability because there's no clear owner left to inherit it. A ship graveyard needs a legal loophole to make abandonment possible. A locomotive graveyard barely needs one. Collapse alone is usually enough. The engine simply becomes property of no one, sitting on land that technically belongs to whichever railway used to exist. Once you know what to look for, this pattern appears on every continent, and not always for the same reason. In Eritrea, Italian colonial engineers built a spectacular mountain railway between the coast and the capital in the early 1900s. During Eritrea's decades-long war of independence, the line was deliberately torn apart, rails and steel sleepers ripped up and repurposed into bunkers and fortifications, locomotives left to rust in sheds because there was no functioning state left to maintain them. That's abandonment by war, not economics. The railway didn't run out of money so much as run out of country. In the United States, the reasons are almost purely financial, but they cut both ways. Some locomotives get scrapped fast because a Class 1 railroad would rather melt down an old unit than hand a working locomotive to a competitor. Others get parked, not scrapped, in long rows in the desert, like the roughly 300 Union Pacific locomotives lined up for 3 miles outside Benson, Arizona. Those units aren't dead. They're mothballed during downturns in freight demand, deliberately stored in a dry desert climate specifically because arid air slows down rust, ready to be pulled back into service if the economy turns around. It's less a graveyard than a locomotive fridge, but from a drone shot, it looks almost identical to Uyuni. And when American locomotives do get scrapped, accounting rules shape the timeline as much as physics does. A retired unit can sit on a railroad's books as stored equipment for up to 2 years before it's formally written off and released for scrap. The bulldozer doesn't show up because the engine broke. It shows up because a spreadsheet finally allowed it to. There's an even blunter version of this story in New Zealand. When the country's railway operator retired a batch of obsolete steam locomotives decades ago and scrap prices happened to be low, the cheapest solution wasn't scrapping them at all. It was dumping the engines on a stretch of eroding coastline near Oamaru to use as makeshift erosion control. The locomotives weren't valuable enough to scrap, so their owner simply repurposed them as breakwater rubble. 3 very different countries, 3 very different triggers: war, a demand slump, and a cheap engineering fix. And all 3 ended in the same picture: dead locomotives, parked in place because it was the path of least resistance. Strip away the individual stories, and there's one uncomfortable rule sitting underneath all of them: a locomotive is only valuable while it's on a railway that wants it. The moment it isn't, it becomes an enormous, extremely heavy, extremely immobile object that costs real money just to get rid of. Modern railroading has actually made this worse in one specific way. Many locomotives today aren't even owned by the railroads running them. They're leased through banking and leasing corporations for terms of around 15 years. When the lease ends, the railroad can buy the unit outright or hand it back to the lessor. As emissions regulations tighten and newer, more efficient locomotives make older ones obsolete faster, more units get handed back than kept. And it's the leasing company, not the railroad, that has to decide whether an aging locomotive is worth remarketing, storing, or scrapping. Sometimes the most economical answer for everyone involved is to do nothing. And doing nothing is exactly how a graveyard gets built, one locomotive at a time. Globally, there is no equivalent of a Hong Kong convention for locomotives. No international treaty regulating how member railways must retire their rolling stock. There's no financial force pulling dead locomotives toward proper recycling the way scrap steel demand pulls dead ships toward Along. A ship graveyard exists because scrapping is profitable enough to be worth doing badly. A train graveyard usually exists because, in that specific place, at that specific moment, scrapping wasn't profitable enough to be worth doing at all. That's really what unites every train graveyard on Earth, from the salt flats of Bolivia to the war-scarred mountains of Eritrea, to a quiet siding outside Benson, Arizona. A locomotive doesn't get abandoned because someone is careless. It gets abandoned because, at the exact moment, its usefulness ran out. Moving it cost more than leaving it, and there was no one left with both the money and the legal obligation to do anything about it. The tourists who climb on those rusted engines at Uyuni today are standing on the physical remains of a railway's balance sheet. It wasn't a decision, it was the absence of one. So next time you see a photo of a train graveyard and think it looks like the end of the world, it's actually the end of a spreadsheet. If you want to know why nobody wants to drive locomotives anymore, watch this video next.